On a quiet afternoon in June 1914, a 17-year-old boy stood on a street corner in a small Balkan city, holding a pistol he barely knew how to use, waiting for a man he had never met, for a plan that had already failed twice that morning. He had no idea that within 90 seconds, he would light a fuse that had been burning quietly under an entire continent for 30 years. He had no idea that his 5 bullets would help kill 17 million people, and neither did anyone else in Europe that summer. Because the truth is far stranger and far more terrifying than any single villain, any single mistake, any single spark. The truth is that by the summer of 1914, Europe did not need an excuse to go to war. It was already standing on top of a powder keg, so tall, so unstable, so tightly packed with pride, fear, and steel that almost anything could have set it off. A royal wedding gone wrong, a border skirmish in Africa, a newspaper headline. It just happened to be a bullet in Sarajevo, and by the time you finish watching this, you will understand exactly how the most civilized, most advanced, most optimistic continent on Earth built its own grave, one decision at a time, and then marched into it smiling. Stay until the end, because the way this all falls apart, in the final 10 days before the guns went silent, will genuinely shock you. Rewind 14 years, step into Europe in the year 1900, and you would swear you had arrived in paradise. Electric lights lined the boulevards of Paris. Steel and glass towers rose over Berlin and Vienna. Railways stitched together nations that had been fighting each other for 1,000 years. The telephone, the automobile, the moving picture, all of it was new, all of it was dazzling, and all of it convinced an entire generation that humanity had finally outgrown war. Newspapers called it an age of progress. Philosophers called it the end of history. Ordinary people called it simply the beautiful time, because for the wealthy and the comfortable, it truly was beautiful. Kings and queens across the continent were literally cousins, bound by blood, exchanging letters in the same handwriting, hosting each other at the same lavish weddings. How could relatives go to war with relatives? How could a world this connected, this modern, this prosperous, possibly tear itself apart? That question felt almost naive to ask out loud, and that is exactly what made the coming catastrophe so much worse. Because underneath every ballroom, every railway station, every gleaming factory, something else was quietly multiplying. Something nobody wanted to look at directly, and it was growing fast. Here is what the postcards never showed you. Beneath that glittering surface, 5 empires were circling each other like animals that had not yet decided to fight, but had also never fully trusted one another to remain at peace. In the east, Russia, the largest, poorest, and most unpredictable of the great powers, ruled by a czar who was gentle at home and disastrously indecisive on the world stage, a man who had already watched his empire humiliated in a war against Japan less than a decade earlier, and who now desperately needed a victory to prove Russia still mattered. To the west, France, a nation still nursing a wound that had never healed, because in 1871 it had been crushed in a single humiliating war by a country that, at the time, did not even exist yet. That country was Germany, and its birth changed everything. Stitched together out of dozens of small kingdoms by a ruthless statesman, who openly declared that the great questions of the era would be decided not by speeches or by parliaments, but by iron and blood. Germany exploded onto the world stage with a fury nobody had planned for. Within 40 years, it outproduced Britain, France, and Russia combined in steel. Its universities became the envy of the world. Its army became the most efficient killing machine ever assembled on the continent. And then, in 1888, the one man who had carefully kept that terrifying power in check was pushed aside by a new emperor, a restless, insecure, attention-hungry young ruler who craved uniforms, parades, and grand declarations far more than he understood diplomacy. He was the grandson of Britain's own queen, and yet he was consumed by jealousy of British power, especially the Royal Navy, the most feared fleet on Earth. So he announced he would build a navy to match it, ship for ship, gun for gun. And with that single decision, he did something almost unforgivable in the eyes of an island nation that had never once in centuries allowed a rival to challenge it at sea. He forced Great Britain, the most powerful empire on the planet, into a corner. Britain had never wanted to be pulled into Europe's quarrels. Its entire strategy for 100 years had been to stay offshore, protect its trade routes, protect its colonies, and let the continental powers exhaust themselves fighting each other. But an emperor with wounded pride and an unstoppable navy program left the British with no choice. Quietly, reluctantly, Britain found itself edging closer to France and to Russia. the very countries it had fought or distrusted for generations, simply because the alternative, a Germany that ruled both the land and the sea, was unthinkable. And then there was the empire that almost nobody in 1914 expected to survive the decade, even without a war. Austria-Hungary, an ancient, creaking, multi-ethnic patchwork ruled by an emperor in his 80s who had already buried his wife, his son, and his brother to violence and tragedy. An empire held together by little more than loyalty to that one exhausted old man, while a dozen different nationalities inside its borders quietly dreamed of independence. Historians would later call it an anachronism, a dynasty from another century trying to survive in a world of nations and democracies that no longer wanted kings. Its only reliable ally was the one nation on earth growing more powerful, more impatient, and more dangerous by the year, Germany. And so by the early 1900s, the great powers of Europe had sorted themselves into two armed camps, watching each other, arming against each other, and bound by treaties that were supposed to prevent war, but that were quietly making it almost impossible to avoid. On one side, the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Each alliance was designed as a shield. Each one, without anyone fully realizing it, was slowly becoming a trigger. Because now, if a single country in either camp went to war, its allies were bound by paper promises to join in behind it. A local quarrel between two small nations could, in theory, ignite 5 empires simultaneously. Nobody in power seemed willing to say that sentence out loud. But the machinery for exactly that scenario was already built, tested, and waiting. If the politics were dangerous, what happened next in the military academies of Europe was far worse, because it turned every one of these tensions into a countdown that could not be paused. Watching Germany's shockingly fast victory over France back in 1871, every general on the continent drew the same terrifying lesson. Overwhelming force wins wars quickly. So build the biggest army you possibly can, and build it faster than your neighbors. For the first time in European history, governments introduced universal military conscription. Young men were pulled from farms and factories, trained for 2 or 3 brutal years, then released into massive reserve forces that could be recalled within days. Russia and France assembled peacetime armies of over 1 million men each. Germany pushed past 2 million. Every time one nation added another division, another rival panicked and matched it. Because falling behind now meant something far more dangerous than embarrassment. It meant annihilation in the next war. War colleges sprang up across the continent, turning combat into something closer to mathematics than heroism, with officers drafting increasingly rigid, increasingly irreversible timetables for exactly how fast their millions of soldiers could be loaded onto trains and marched to the border. One German general put it bluntly: stop building fortresses, start building railways, because in the coming war, whichever army arrived at the frontier first, fastest, and best organized, was expected to win everything. At sea, the arms race turned almost theatrical. When Britain unveiled a revolutionary new class of battleship bristling with heavy guns, every rival nation scrambled to build their own version within months. In Germany, one industrialist unveiled a monstrous mobile artillery piece capable of hurling a shell weighing a full ton across 9 miles of open ground. And yet, astonishingly, almost nobody among the generals actually understood how catastrophically destructive these new weapons truly were. British commanders insisted cavalry could still charge through modern machine gun fire. Russian military leaders trusted the bayonet over the rifle. French doctrine leaned on something almost mystical called élan, a belief that sheer patriotic spirit and aggressive charging could overwhelm any defense, no matter how many machine guns waited on the other side. It would take a war of unimaginable horror to teach an entire generation of officers just how wrong they truly were. But in the meantime, factories kept producing, shipyards kept launching, and every single nation quietly convinced itself it was only preparing to defend against the others, never realizing that all 5 of them were preparing for exactly the same collision at exactly the same time. But before we go any further, here is a fact that almost never makes it into the history books, and it might be the strangest one of all. In the last year of true peace, an eccentric British journalist wrote an entire book arguing that a major European war had become economically impossible because the continent's banks, railways, and industries were now so tightly interlinked that any nation foolish enough to start a war would bankrupt itself within months. The book became an international bestseller. Bankers quoted it, diplomats quoted it. Ordinary readers found it comforting. Almost proof that the unthinkable simply could not happen anymore. Within 5 years, that same author would watch nearly an entire generation of young men from every country in Europe die in trenches he never imagined, disproving his own celebrated theory in the most horrifying way possible. That is how confident Europe was standing on the edge of the abyss. That is how little anyone actually understood what they had built. Now, here is where most documentaries stop and simply tell you the war was inevitable. It was not, and that single fact is what makes everything you are about to watch so much harder to accept. Because in the final weeks before the guns opened fire, there were at least a dozen separate moments where one different decision, one delayed telegram, one calmer head in one single palace could have stopped everything that followed. Keep that in mind as we step hour by hour into the 10 days that changed the world forever. It began far from the grand capitals, in a restless region called the Balkans, a patchwork of young nations that had only recently thrown off centuries of foreign rule and now hungered for territory, respect, and revenge against their neighbors. The most ambitious of them was a small, fiercely proud kingdom called Serbia, and its most obvious target for expansion sat right next door. The sprawling, fragile empire of Austria-Hungary, whose southern territories were packed with ethnic Serbs who dreamed of one day joining their homeland. Inside Serbia, a secretive group of ultranationalist conspirators, calling themselves the Black Hand, decided that dream deserved a push. Their target could not have been chosen more perfectly or more disastrously for the entire continent. On the morning of June the 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne arrived in the regional capital of Sarajevo for what was supposed to be a routine, almost ceremonial visit. He came without a proper security escort, confident, almost naively so, in the loyalty of his subjects. Waiting in the crowd that morning were 7 young conspirators armed with pistols and small bombs, most of them barely out of their teens, and almost none of them trained for what they were about to attempt. Their first chance came and went in chaos. A bomb thrown at the motorcade bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded behind it instead, wounding bystanders and sending the procession speeding away in confusion. By any reasonable measure, the plot had already failed. The Archduke could have left the city immediately, and history might have unfolded in an entirely different direction. Instead, he insisted on visiting the wounded in hospital first, an act of decency that would cost him his life. Because of a wrong turn, a driver unfamiliar with a last-minute change of route, the Archduke's car stopped, reversed, and stalled directly in front of a small delicatessen on a quiet street corner. The exact spot where one of the failed conspirators, a slight, sickly 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing after abandoning the plot entirely, convinced it had already collapsed. He looked up. He could not believe what he was seeing. Barely 5 feet away sat the man he had come to kill. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired twice. Within minutes, the Archduke and his wife were both dead. World War I had just claimed its first 2 victims, and the fuse, the one that had been quietly burning under Europe for 30 years, had finally reached the powder. What happened over the following month is one of the most chilling chain reactions in human history, because at almost every stage, the people responsible knew exactly how catastrophic the outcome could become and pressed forward anyway. Austria-Hungary, humiliated and furious, drafted an ultimatum to Serbia so severe, so deliberately impossible to fully accept, that its authors privately admitted they were not seeking peace at all. They were manufacturing an excuse for war. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond. And then, almost unbelievably, Serbia accepted nearly every single demand. For one fragile, glimmering moment, it looked as if disaster had been narrowly avoided. Even Germany's emperor, upon hearing the news, declared with visible relief that there was no longer any excuse for war and no need to mobilize. He was catastrophically wrong. Behind his back, his own top general had already secretly promised Vienna that Germany would stand behind Austria no matter what happened next, undercutting his own emperor's attempt at restraint. Austria-Hungary, egged on by generals hungry for a swift, decisive local war, declared war on Serbia anyway. Pause on that for a second, because this is the moment everything could have stopped. A small war contained, local, over within weeks, exactly as everyone in Vienna and Berlin had originally planned. If the story had ended right here, you would not be watching this video today. But it did not end here. One more decision, made thousands of miles away in a palace outside Moscow, was about to turn a regional punishment into a continental catastrophe. That should have been the end of it. A short, contained conflict between 2 unequal neighbors. Instead, Russia's Tsar, desperate to protect his fellow Slavic people in Serbia and terrified of looking weak after his humiliation in the war against Japan, ordered something almost unimaginable in scale, a full general mobilization of the largest army on the planet. Historians still debate whether that single decision was even necessary. What is certain is that once it began, it could not be undone. In the desperate 10 days that followed, the rulers of Russia and Germany, first cousins bound by blood, exchanged a flurry of urgent telegrams, each one pleading with the other to halt the march toward catastrophe, each one simultaneously ordering his own generals to prepare for exactly that catastrophe. The messages crossed in transit. By the time one telegram of reassurance arrived, the situation on the ground had already changed completely, rendering it meaningless. The men who supposedly held the ultimate power, the Tsar, the Emperor, the Kaiser, discovered in real time that they were no longer the ones actually in control. Their own generals were, and those generals were not thinking about how to prevent a war anymore. They were thinking only about how to win one, and in the calculus of 1914, winning meant mobilizing first, and mobilizing first meant attacking first. Germany's plan for the coming war depended entirely on speed. Trapped between two powerful rivals, France to the west and the vast Russian army to the east, German strategists believed their only realistic chance of survival was to knock France out of the fight within weeks, then rush their armies eastward before Russia's slower, more massive mobilization could finish assembling. But the fastest invasion route into France ran directly through one small, officially neutral country, a country whose independence had been formally guaranteed by treaty since 1839, a piece of paper nearly 75 years old that suddenly stood in the way of an unstoppable war machine. On August the 2nd, Germany delivered an ultimatum demanding free passage through that neutral territory or invasion. The very next day, the country's king flatly refused. German troops crossed the border regardless. And that single violated treaty, that single scrap of paper gave Britain, the one great power still desperately hoping to stay out of the fight, no honorable way left to avoid it. Britain declared war on Germany within hours. In an instant, every single member of both alliances stood locked in combat. What had begun as a regional dispute over an assassination in a Balkan city had in barely 1 month dragged the 5 most powerful empires on Earth into a single, unstoppable collision. And here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. The detail almost nobody talks about. On the streets, away from the panicked telegrams and the desperate generals, ordinary people were not afraid at all. In city after city, enormous cheering crowds gathered to celebrate the coming war, convinced it would be short, glorious, and over by autumn. Soldiers marched off to their trains, covered in flowers, laughing, singing, absolutely certain they would be home again within weeks. Even political movements built entirely around opposing war suddenly abandoned their principles overnight, swept up in a tidal wave of patriotic fever because every single nation involved had somehow convinced itself and its own people that this war was purely defensive, forced upon them by someone else's aggression. Germans blamed Russia, Austrians blamed Serbia, the French blamed Germany, the British pointed to a violated treaty and a small trampled nation. Everyone had a righteous reason. Nobody believed they had started it. And that collective, continent-wide delusion, the false certainty that this war could somehow be quick, clean, and controlled, may be the single most dangerous ingredient in this entire story. Within days, 6 million men across the continent had received marching orders. Kaiser Wilhelm personally promised his own soldiers they would be home again before the leaves fell that autumn. He could not have been more wrong. In the first month of fighting alone, over 300,000 French soldiers were killed. By the end of that same year, Germany alone had lost close to 1 million men. The leaves fell that autumn exactly as promised. The soldiers did not come home. Instead, both sides dug in along a scarred, bleeding line stretching across an entire continent and settled into 4 more years of grinding, mechanized, industrialized slaughter that no general, no emperor, and no crowd of cheering civilians in the summer of 1914 could have possibly imagined. By the time it finally ended, the war that was supposed to be over in weeks had lasted more than 4 agonizing years and claimed somewhere close to 17 million lives. Soldiers and civilians combined. It resolved almost none of the tensions that had caused it, and yet it changed absolutely everything it touched. Three of the ancient royal dynasties that had ruled Europe for centuries, in Germany, in Austria-Hungary, and in Russia, were swept away entirely, one of them replaced by a revolutionary communist government that would go on to reshape the 20th century. Britain's once unchallenged global empire began an irreversible decline, and Germany, blamed publicly for starting the entire catastrophe and crushed under an almost impossible burden of war debt and reparations, did not disappear quietly. It simmered, humiliated, and resentful for exactly 21 years before rising again, angrier, more radicalized, and infinitely more dangerous than before. People at the time called this the war to end all wars. History would prove with horrifying precision that it was nothing of the sort. It was only the opening act. So the next time someone tells you that a single assassin, one teenager on one street corner, single-handedly started the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen, you will know the real answer. He did not build the powder keg. Europe had spent 30 years building that all on its own, brick by brick, treaty by treaty, warship by warship, without ever once admitting to itself what it was actually constructing. He simply happened to be standing there, on the one afternoon in 30 years, when the fuse finally found its spark. And if a single continent full of the smartest, wealthiest, most advanced nations on Earth could sleepwalk into its own destruction without anyone truly believing it was happening, it is worth asking, quietly, uncomfortably, whether the very same thing could be happening again right now, somewhere in the world, and whether we would even recognize it if it was.